Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in once again to our weekly legislative update video. There actually was quite a bit of movement that did happen, especially on tax, in the Senate and the House this week, both of which occurred yesterday. And the reason that we're seeing that is due to the federal tax reform changes as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Iowans will pay about $1.8 billion less in federal taxes in tax year 2018, but due to the fact that Iowa has federal deductibility, or the fact you can deduct your federal tax liability off of your state tax liability, Iowans will pay an additional $107 million in tax year 2018, and that number will grow to an additional $153 million in tax year FY 2019, in tax year 2019, which is a very evident piece of why we need to start doing tax reform, because the governor's office and the House and the Senate have all agreed that those dollars should not go for new state spending. They should be returned to the taxpayers, because that's where those revenues would be coming from in the first place. So we now have two different competing proposals, which is a little perplexing this late in the session when we're closing in on 100 days on Wednesday the 17th, or Tuesday the 17th. It's a little perplexing when we see the House come out with one completely different bill than what the Senate has come out with, and then the governor's office is kind of been in the discussions, but we don't really know formally where they are in the process. So that kind of the fact that they're not meshed at this point has been concerning to several individuals. So the tax bill that came out of the House was something that the business community, frankly, was not very impressed with, pleased with, was kind of disenchanted with. And that includes not only the Iowa Chamber Alliance, but the Iowa Association of Business and Industry, Iowa Business Council, Professional Developers of Iowa, Americans for Prosperity, Iowans for Tax Relief, and Iowa Taxpayers Association. All of them were very much perplexed by the bill that this House came out with, because the major reason for them being so perplexed was the fact that it doesn't include federal deductibility, which is something they had talked about for a long time getting rid of, so it doesn't include that at all, and it doesn't also include any corporate income tax reform. It does lower individual income taxes, but it does nothing for the corporate, which is something that we've talked about ever since this whole conversation began, not only years ago, but this session. So it was a little bit interesting to see that that was the bill they came out with, and then it was even more interesting when then the Senate came out with an entirely different bill, which then scaled back the bill that they had put out in, I believe, February, that was about $1 billion per year. This one is about 50 to 60% of what they had proposed then. We haven't seen bill language out of the Senate yet, but we are expected to see that here probably next week. And that is something that Senator Feenstra said to his Democratic colleagues they would provide in 24 hours before they would have a vote in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So we will watch for that language, because also the Senate, with that language, Senator Feenstra said we would expect to see a fiscal note, which is going to be a very important piece as we look at talking about potentially, upwards of $733 million being kept by Iowa taxpayers in the first 2 years. So we really do need to see, okay, so what are some of these funnels that they're coming from? And then also, how are they going to be paid for? That's something that, as a very large public sector community Ames is, we're very much concerned about where are those pay for is going to come from, because we don't want one at the expense of the other. While we very much do want corporate and individual income tax reform, it's our top priority this year, we do want to make sure that it's done in a fiscally responsible way that's not going to do any harm to our partners here throughout the community and county. So one of the things the Senate proposal does include federal deductibility. It does include corporate tax reductions. It does eliminate the alternative minimum tax. It does do more for Section 179 and federal coupling, as well as the qualified business income. These are all really important to small businesses and also the ag community. So that's things that a lot of individuals in the room yesterday at the hearing for the subcommittee for the Senate tax proposal were happy to see. But once again, we all just really want to see the details, because as they say, the devil's in the details. So we really do want to see what that looks like, and then what we can do moving forward, and how we can best advocate to get that to move forward. And just kind of to touch on some of the big things that we were concerned about in the House bill, the fact that that doesn't include corporate income tax reform is very much a concern to us. That's something we had talked about with them for a long time, and it just didn't include it, and it was very perplexing. As I said, no federal deductibility. That's something everyone down there essentially has been talking about since this discussion began, so that was rather perplexing. No decrease in rates and brackets for corporate. And then they seem to be moving, as I said, further apart, with the Senate and the House, and then the governor somewhere in there as well. And obviously all three have to come to an agreement before they can essentially leave and adjourn for the session. So that's something that's kind of a concern as well for some people. But then also the fact of the matter is we still haven't seen the big budget numbers, and those are all going to be tied directly together. They're going to be intrinsically tied together. So that's something that we're going to continue to watch as we go forward. We're hoping that we can see the bill from the Senate sooner rather than later, but that kind of remains to be seen as we wait for that announcement coming up here next week. So one thing we can say though is we do look forward to working with both sides, the Senate and the House, and also the governor's office, as they look to try to figure out how this looks going forward and how they can do it in a way that everyone finds amenable. And we really do look forward to being in that discussion because, as I mentioned with Iowa Chamber Alliance and also all those other business organizations that were mentioned before, we all expect to have a say in how that looks because we usually are the ones that are representing, not usually, we are the ones that represent the business community, and they are looking for us to kind of provide input as to what that should look like in a fiscally responsible way. On one final note, on a different subject, I did get some information on the tax increment financing bill that was proposed by the House Appropriations. The good news is it sounds like as of now that doesn't have a lot of momentum behind it, so we were happy to hear that, but that is of course something that we'll continue to watch. Another major thing we'll continue to watch too is the SAVE extension to see how that moves forward for the school infrastructure. Nothing new on that, but we do continue to watch it, especially as we move into the appropriations part of the end of the session. And then once again, obviously, as I just stated, the appropriations bills. That's something that we're going to be watching very closely because there's some very important things that are going to be embedded within that, whether it's TIF backfill or property tax backfill for the community in Story County and also the school districts. But then also, as we look at, will Iowa State get any funding for their veterinary diagnostics lab? That's something that's incredibly important for not only the state, the nation, but obviously our good friends at Iowa State. So we want to make sure we're watching things like that as the appropriations come out, and that's what we will continue to be doing as we go into next week. As we get into the wee hours, so to speak, of this session before they adjourn here in the next couple weeks, which they won't be adjourning this week as scheduled, but we will continue to watch all of these major issues because they will be a critical part of the equation going forward, especially as we end a General Assembly and have elections coming up here in June and then November. So please come back and join us next week. As you can tell, there's a lot going on, and we expect there to be even more next week. So please do come back and join us and have a great weekend. Thank you.